Young people mock a black man on the bus, unaware they are ridiculing none other than Michael B. Jordan. Without knowing his true identity, they have no idea that the humiliation he faces will lead to an unexpected transformation. The stale scent of sweat mixed with the lingering aroma of fried food and stale cologne hung heavily in the air. The rattling of the old bus echoed through the streets, its worn tires bouncing over every pothole. It was late afternoon, the last rays of sunlight filtering through the grimy windows. The heat inside the cramped bus was suffocating, and the sticky vinyl seats clung to his skin as he shifted uncomfortably. His fingers gripped the cold metal pole tightly, knuckles turning white. He wasn't alone, no, far from it, but in that moment, it felt as though he were the only one in the world. His heart pounded loudly in his chest, each beat a reminder of the chaos around him and the void inside him. The laughter. The harsh, mocking laughter. It stabbed at his soul, sharp and unforgiving. It came from the back of the bus. A group of young men, laughing, pointing, whispering, casting sidelong glances in his direction. He could feel their eyes on him, a strange blend of pity and contempt. It was no surprise. He had been here before. Every day was the same, every journey, every stop, every taunt. Their voices echoed, loud enough for him to hear the cruel, degrading words they spewed, but soft enough to maintain the illusion that it was all just a joke. "Man, look at this dude," one of them sneered. "He thinks he's someone important or something." His words were followed by a burst of laughter. He flinched, his body instinctively wanting to shrink away, to disappear. But he couldn't. He was trapped. The bus moved forward, inching through the crowded streets. The walls of the bus, the people sitting around him, they all felt suffocating. He could almost taste the stares, bitter and cold, as though every person on this bus had a hand in his humiliation. His heart sank, and the tears threatened to come, but he wouldn't let them fall. Not here, not now. Instead, he stood still, his breath shaky, hands trembling with the weight of everything he had been through. The taunts didn't stop. They grew worse, more vile, as the young men's voices got louder. "Hey, bro, you some kind of celebrity or something?" one of them asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Another laughed. "Maybe he's a wannabe rapper or some shit. What, you got money or something?" The voices escalated into cruel laughter, cutting through his resolve like a knife. His fists clenched, his chest tight with the humiliation of it all. If only they knew. If only they could see who he really was beneath this facade. He was a man, like anyone else, just trying to survive, just trying to make his way through life without getting crushed under the weight of his own despair. But they didn't know. No one knew. They didn't know that his life had been nothing but a string of betrayals and rejection. They didn't know that his heart had been shattered more times than he could count, that the pain of abandonment had left deep scars that no one could see. And now, here he was, enduring the ridicule of strangers who had no idea what he had been through, what he was still going through. And the worst part? He didn't even know how to explain it. How could he? The world had made it clear that no one cared. Not really. Not deeply. They saw him only for what he could offer, never for who he truly was. As the bus jolted to a stop, he glanced out the window, his eyes meeting the reflection of the man he had become. He saw nothing but a tired, broken version of himself staring back. His clothes were faded, his hair unkempt, and his eyes were full of the emptiness he couldn't shake. But just as the humiliation began to settle in like a heavy blanket over his heart, something shifted inside him. A voice, small but persistent, whispered within him, "You're worth more than this." He didn't know where it came from, but it was there. He hadn't heard that voice in years. The voice that reminded him of who he was, who he could be. And for the first time in a long time, he dared to listen to it. He slowly straightened up, his back stiffening. He was done. Done with feeling small, done with being the butt of the joke. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. The weight of the humiliation was still there, but it no longer held him down. Not completely. As the young men at the back of the bus continued their mockery, he stood tall. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know that the man they were ridiculing was no ordinary man. But they would. The bus hummed along the crowded streets, its tires squeaking, and the rickety windows rattling. The noise of the engine, the honking of distant cars, and the constant chatter of commuters created a cacophony of urban life. But inside, in the cramped, dimly lit space, all of that noise felt muted to him. As the bus bumped along, he found himself staring blankly ahead, at the same cracked leather seat in front of him. His mind raced, heart still pounding, and the voices from the back of the bus continued to echo in his ears. "Look at him, man," a voice mocked, sharp and loud. "This dude definitely thinks he's something. What a joke." The laughter that followed was unrestrained, like the punch of a fist to his gut, each laugh heavier than the last. The insults piled on one after another, like bricks being thrown at a fragile wall. "Is he a model or something?" another voice sneered. "Dude looks like he could be in a movie, like one of those low-budget flicks nobody watches." The words cut deep. They didn't know who they were talking about. He wanted to scream, to stand up and tell them the truth, that he wasn't just some random man sitting on this bus, that he was someone who mattered. But the words never came. Instead, he swallowed the knot in his throat, forcing his body to stay still. Silence, for now, was his shield. But there was something different about today. He could feel it. The anger that had been buried deep within him for so long, simmering quietly under the surface, was rising up like a tide. It wasn't just the insults. It wasn't just the mockery. It was everything. All the years of rejection. All the hurt from the people who had turned their backs on him. The endless feeling of being invisible, of being rejected, of never being enough. The laughter continued behind him, but this time, something inside him shifted. No more. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. He knew this wasn't the first time he'd been humiliated, nor would it be the last. But this time, something inside him snapped. The hurt, the loneliness, and the bitterness of it all had reached a breaking point. He was done being silent. In the brief moments of quiet, he turned his head slightly toward the back of the bus. The group of young men who had been so eager to make him the subject of their cruel jokes were still talking among themselves. They hadn't noticed him looking yet. And so, for a split second, he allowed himself to imagine what he would do if they knew the truth about him. They didn't know. They didn't know that the man they were laughing at was Michael B. Jordan. The very same actor they admired on the big screen. The man they so often idolized without ever recognizing the face before them. They saw only what they wanted to see, a man who didn't fit their idea of what a successful person should look like. They didn't know that his life had been full of struggles, just like theirs. That he, too, had walked through the fire of rejection and self-doubt. He shifted in his seat, and the brief moment of silence gave him space to think. What was he supposed to do? Walk up to them and tell them they were mocking someone who had worked hard to get where he was? Should he reveal his identity and crush their ego? Should he show them his scars, his flaws, his dreams? But even as these questions swirled in his mind, another part of him whispered something more important. It's not about them. It was about him. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his power, and his worth. The constant validation from others, especially strangers, had only ever kept him chained to their expectations. No, he wouldn't let their ridicule define him. Not this time. He clenched his fists again, but this time, it wasn't out of anger. It was out of strength. But as the bus moved, his thoughts were interrupted. A voice, this time, came from the front. The bus driver had announced that they were reaching his stop. With a deep breath, he stood, his body moving almost automatically, his eyes trained straight ahead. As he made his way toward the exit, the young men behind him fell silent, likely noticing that he had stood to leave. For a brief second, he thought they might say something else, another cruel joke to send him off with one last sting. But they didn't. Instead, he heard one of them whispering among the others, the words barely audible but sharp nonetheless. "Yo, who the hell was that guy? He really looked like someone." And just like that, he was out. The air was cooler outside, the street lights flickering against the deepening night. He stood there for a moment, taking in the crispness of the air, allowing himself to breathe. The weight of the last few minutes still hung heavy, but for the first time, it didn't feel suffocating. "They don't know you," he thought, standing tall. "They never will." The truth was, even though the young men on the bus had mocked him without a second thought, their ignorance didn't hurt as much as it once did. Because in their ignorance, he had found a strength that was his alone. They had mistaken him for an ordinary man, a man of no consequence. But they would never know the truth. And that was fine. He walked away from the bus stop, each step forward a small victory, knowing that the road ahead was filled with endless possibilities. The evening air was sharp as it swept through the streets, brushing against his skin, but inside him, the sting of humiliation still lingered. As he walked, he could feel the heat rising in his chest, the words of the young men bouncing in his mind like a cruel echo. He had been taunted before, of course, more times than he cared to count. But this time felt different. It wasn't just the mocking laughter or the rude comments. It was the crushing feeling of being misunderstood, of having people look at him and see only what they wanted to see, an ordinary, unimportant man. He had always tried to push away those feelings, to bury them under layers of fame, success, and everything the world said he should be. But tonight, it felt like the weight of his own identity was too much to carry. He had spent so much time playing the part that he had lost track of who he was beneath the mask. The streets were quiet now, the lights casting long shadows across the pavement. He walked past familiar storefronts, his steps slow, deliberate. He wasn't in a rush to go anywhere, not yet. His mind was racing, caught between the past and the present, the man he was and the man they thought he was. It wasn't just the strangers on the bus who didn't know who he really was, it was everyone. For years, he had built a reputation, a life that others could admire from a distance. He was Michael B. Jordan. He had been the man on screen, the charming, confident actor, admired by millions. The world saw his face in movies and magazines, his name on red carpets and award shows. But behind the scenes, he was just like anyone else, a man who still struggled with his worth. A man who still felt alone. As he passed by a corner cafe, the flicker of a TV screen caught his attention. He stopped, glancing at the reflection of himself on the screen, a familiar face that he no longer recognized. It was an interview, one of those countless promotional ones he had done. He barely remembered the conversation, but the image of himself on that screen felt like someone else. He looked at the confident smile on his face, the way his eyes sparkled as he answered questions. But it was all a performance. A mask he had worn for years. And here, on this empty street, away from the cameras, he felt raw. He wasn't the person they thought he was. He wasn't just some character. He wasn't invincible. He was a human being, filled with insecurities, with scars that no one could see. "Hey, is that him?" A voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned, his gaze meeting the two young men who had mocked him on the bus. They were standing just outside the cafe, their eyes wide, unsure if they should approach him. The same ones who had laughed at him minutes ago, now looking at him as if they were seeing him for the first time. "Yo, what's up?" one of them said hesitantly, as if unsure of his own words. "I didn't mean to." He stopped him with a single look, a mixture of calm and something far stronger, something almost unrecognizable. "I'm Michael," he said simply, his voice firm, a stark contrast to the uncertainty that had defined him moments ago. "You don't need to apologize. I'm not here for that." The two young men exchanged a quick glance, their expressions shifting from confusion to realization. They had recognized him. The man they had been mocking, the man they had called some nobody, was Michael B. Jordan. The same actor whose films they had watched, whose interviews they had seen. The same man they had ridiculed without knowing who he really was. One of them stammered, his voice breaking the silence. "I didn't know, man. I swear, I didn't mean anything by it. It was just... I was just playing around." Michael looked at him, studying his face. The young man's nervousness was palpable, his words trailing off as he fidgeted. And for a moment, Michael felt no anger. There was no satisfaction in this moment, no triumph. He didn't need their apology. He didn't even want it. What he needed now was something far more important. "You think I'm just a joke?" Michael asked, his tone not harsh, but direct. The young man nodded slowly, a hint of shame creeping into his expression. "Yeah, I mean, you just looked different. Like, I thought you were just some guy, you know. I didn't recognize you." The other young man remained silent, his eyes on the ground. Michael took a step forward, looking both of them in the eye. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know who I am or what I've been through. But you know what? That's okay. It's not your job to know me. But you should know this, your words hurt. And you're not the only ones who don't understand. I've been looked at, dismissed, and rejected my whole life. I've been told I'm not enough. I've been laughed at. So when you think it's funny to make fun of someone because they don't fit your expectations, just remember, what you see on the outside doesn't tell the whole story." The young men stood frozen, their eyes wide, as if they had just been given a glimpse into a world they never knew existed. Michael could see the shift in their expressions. It was the first step toward understanding. The first crack in their judgment. Without waiting for them to respond, Michael turned and walked away, leaving the two young men standing there, speechless. They had learned something, even if they didn't realize it yet. As Michael disappeared into the night, he felt something shift within himself. It wasn't just about the apology. It wasn't about proving himself. It was about his own recognition of his worth. It wasn't the fame that made him valuable. It wasn't the title or the accolades. It was the man inside, the one who had fought through pain, through rejection, through everything the world had thrown at him. And for the first time, he truly understood that. The streets were quieter now, the hum of the city replaced by the occasional rustling of trees swaying in the evening breeze. Michael walked alone, his thoughts running faster than his feet could carry him. The encounter with the two young men on the street had left him with a feeling of detachment. Part of him felt liberated, while another part of him couldn't shake the feeling of being torn apart. It wasn't about the apology, nor the recognition. It was something deeper, something he had been running from for years. He had spent so long building a mask for the world to see, the confident actor, the charming celebrity, the man with a life others could only dream of. But all of that, everything he had worked so hard to create, felt empty now. The fame, the success, the constant attention, it was all just a distraction. The real work had always been within himself. He found himself standing at the corner of an unfamiliar street, the glow of a neon sign flickering from a nearby convenience store. He needed to clear his mind. He needed some time alone to process what had just happened, the unexpected confrontation, the realization that he was seen as a joke, a nobody in the eyes of the very people who admired him from afar. But there was no time to stop. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the vibrations cutting through the silence of the night. He pulled it out and checked the message. It was from his agent. "Michael, there's a meeting tomorrow. We need to discuss the next project. You're getting a lot of attention from the press, but we need to be careful with how we handle this. There's been some controversy after your recent comments. Let me know if you're free to talk tonight." He stared at the message for a moment, feeling the weight of his agent's words sink in. The comments they referred to were the ones he had made during a recent interview about the pressure of being a public figure. He had been honest, perhaps too honest, about the emotional toll of his career. About the isolation he felt despite being constantly surrounded by people. About the loneliness that came with being seen as an object of desire rather than a person with real feelings. But honesty, in the world he lived in, was a dangerous thing. He could already feel the tightening in his chest, the pressure of living a life dictated by others' expectations. No matter how much success he achieved, no matter how many awards he won or how many people adored him, it was never enough. He was always performing, always pretending to be something he wasn't. His identity had become a product, something for others to consume, and it had eaten away at him. The phone buzzed again, this time with a call. It was his best friend, Brandon. "Mike, man, what's going on with you?" Brandon's voice crackled through the line. "I saw the press about the bus incident, and then your statement. What's happening? You all right?" Michael paused. He hadn't shared the details of the bus incident with anyone. How could he? How could he explain the hurt he felt being ridiculed by strangers, only to be recognized by them moments later? He wasn't ready to talk about it. "I'm good, Brandon." "Just thinking," Michael replied, his voice quieter than he intended. "A lot's been going on lately. Just need some time to sort through it." Brandon's voice softened. "You know I'm here, man. Always have been. But you've gotta stop pretending everything's fine when it's not. You've been holding all this in for so long, and it's starting to show." Michael looked around, finding an empty bench in the corner of the street. He sat down, running a hand through his hair. He knew his friend was right. But he couldn't face the reality of it all, not yet. "I know," Michael murmured, staring at the ground. I don't know who I am anymore, Brandon. I'm not sure if I ever did." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then Brandon spoke again, his voice quiet and steady. "Mike, you're not just some actor. You're not the face of some movie poster. You're not even the person they see on that bus. You're you. The one who's been through it all. And you're stronger than all of this. Don't forget that." The words hit him harder than he expected. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes, letting them wash over him like a bomb on a wound he hadn't realized was still open. He had spent so many years running from the pain, from the scars of his past, that he had forgotten to face them. "Thanks, man," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "I needed to hear that." After the call ended, Michael sat there for a long time, staring at the dark street ahead. The pressure of the past few days, weeks, months, felt overwhelming. But in that moment, he finally allowed himself to breathe. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need to live up to their expectations. He wasn't just a face on a screen. He wasn't a joke to be laughed at. He was Michael B. Jordan, the man who had survived the storm, who had fought through pain and rejection and come out on the other side. He wasn't perfect, and he wasn't done. But he was enough. The next morning, Michael sat in his apartment, preparing for the meeting with his agent. He glanced at the calendar on his wall, noting the schedule of his upcoming projects. There was a new movie coming up, a role he had been hesitant to take on. But something inside him had shifted overnight, a spark of clarity he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was time to take a different path. Before he could think more on it, his phone rang again. This time, it was a call from an unknown number. "Hello," he answered cautiously. "Mr. Jordan," the voice on the other end said, smooth and formal. "I'm with the casting department for a project you may be interested in. We've been keeping an eye on your recent statements, and we believe you could be perfect for a role in an upcoming production." Michael's heart skipped a beat. But the words that followed chilled him to the core. "We'd like to offer you a role that's a little different than what you're used to. But we think it will be exactly what you need." And just like that, everything shifted. The silence on the other end of the phone hung in the air like an ominous cloud, heavy and thick. Michael's heart thudded in his chest, the words of the mysterious caller still echoing in his mind. "We'd like to offer you a role that's a little different than what you're used to. But we think it will be exactly what you need." The words rattled around his mind. A role? Different? What does that even mean? "Who is this?" he finally asked, his voice steady but laced with caution. He had been in the industry long enough to know that unsolicited calls were often a precursor to something he didn't want to deal with. "I'm sorry, Mr. Jordan," the voice on the line responded coolly. "We understand this is unexpected. But we think you'll be very interested in this opportunity. We can't give details over the phone, but we'd like to meet with you in person. We believe this could be the breakthrough you need." Michael paused, weighing his options. The last few days had felt like a blur, taunts on the bus, conversations that hadn't been easy, moments of realization that left him questioning his purpose in the world. But then, a part of him pushed those questions aside. Maybe this was the chance to break free from the expectations that had always defined him. Maybe this role, whatever it was, could be a way to reclaim his identity on his own terms. "I'm listening," he said, his voice tinged with a sense of resolve. "Great," the caller replied. "We'll send you the details. Just trust us. This is the opportunity you've been waiting for." The call ended abruptly, leaving Michael to sit in the quiet of his apartment, the weight of the decision before him settling in like an invisible force. He had been running for so long from the things that mattered. Was this his chance to stop pretending? Was this the moment to let go of everything he had been trying to uphold? For the first time in a long time, Michael allowed himself to feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about the fame or the role, it was about his life, about the truth of who he was. And for the first time, he realized that truth wasn't something he could hide from any longer. The next day, Michael stood outside the building, its sleek glass windows reflecting the overcast sky. It looked like any other high-rise office building in the city, polished, corporate, and cold. But there was something different about this one. His intuition told him that this wasn't just a meeting about a movie role. As he entered the lobby and made his way to the elevator, his thoughts turned to the events that had led him here. The taunts on the bus had been only a small part of the larger picture. Beneath the mockery, there was a darker truth, a truth he had avoided confronting for years. And that truth was that he didn't just need a new role in a movie. He needed a new role in his own life. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and Michael stepped out into a sleek, modern lobby. A woman at the front desk smiled as he approached, but there was something cold in her expression. She handed him a visitor's pass and gestured toward a door at the far end of the room. "Mr. Jordan, they're waiting for you inside," she said. He nodded, his nerves simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't just about the meeting anymore. It was about what this moment symbolized, the opportunity to take control of his own story, to rewrite the narrative that had been dictated by others for so long. As he stepped into the conference room, he was greeted by a tall man in a dark suit, his face unreadable. The man stood up, extending his hand in greeting. "Mr. Jordan, thank you for coming," he said. "We're glad you decided to meet with us." Michael shook the man's hand firmly, but the unease still lingered in the pit of his stomach. There was something strange about this whole setup, something that didn't sit right with him. "Please, take a seat," the man continued, gesturing to the chairs around the large table. Michael sat down cautiously, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the high-end furniture, the glossy photographs of film sets on the walls, and the general air of professionalism. But none of that reassured him. "So, let's get to it," the man said, leaning forward slightly. "We know this may seem unexpected, but after seeing your recent public statements and the incident that happened on the bus, we feel like we have the perfect role for you. We think you'll connect with it in a way you haven't connected with anything else." Michael's brow furrowed. "You saw the bus incident?" The man nodded, his gaze never wavering. "We did. Someone on the bus filmed it, and it's been all over the news. People are talking. And we think it's the perfect time for you to step into a new kind of role. A role that will truly show the world who you are, not just the actor, but the man." Michael felt a jolt in his chest. The man's words seemed too rehearsed, too calculated. It felt like he was being maneuvered, like a piece in a game he didn't fully understand. "Go on," Michael said cautiously. The man slid a folder across the table to him. Michael opened it slowly, scanning the contents. Inside were photos of himself from various movies, but they weren't the glamorous ones he was used to seeing. These were more intimate shots, behind-the-scenes glimpses of his life that no one had ever seen before. There were also images of the bus incident, shots of him sitting quietly, staring out the window while others laughed at him. "This project," the man continued, "isn't just about a movie. It's about real life. It's about confronting the things people don't understand, showing the world the real Michael B. Jordan, the vulnerable side, the side you've hidden for so long." Michael looked up at the man, his stomach twisting. They knew too much. This wasn't just about a role, it was about something much more invasive. Before he could speak, the man added, "We believe you're ready for it. We believe you've already started down this path on your own. And we want to help you tell that story. The world will love it." Michael's mind raced as he tried to process everything. They weren't offering him a role. They were offering him control over his image, his identity, a story that he hadn't written, but they had already decided for him. And suddenly, he knew. The plot twist wasn't in the role he'd been offered. It was in the realization that this entire meeting, this entire offer, was nothing more than another manipulation. They wanted to own his story, his real story, and shape it into something they could sell to the masses. His pulse quickened, and he made his decision. "I don't think this is what I need," Michael said calmly, standing up from his chair. The man blinked, confusion crossing his face. "What do you mean?" "This could be your breakthrough." "I already have my breakthrough," Michael replied, his voice steady. "And it's not something you can package or sell. It's something I find on my own." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the room, and their manipulation, behind. Michael stepped out into the cool air of the city, his heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and relief. As he walked away from the building, his mind replayed the conversation, the offer, and the cold realization that the world wanted to control him. Not just his image, but his very essence. They wanted to shape him into something they could sell, to make him a product that could be consumed, dissected, and judged by others. He had faced rejection, humiliation, and mockery before, but nothing like this. This was different. It wasn't the casual cruelty of strangers on a bus or the painful sting of missed opportunities. This was the first time he had realized the extent to which his identity had been hijacked, commodified, and used against him. They hadn't even cared to understand the real Michael B. Jordan, the man beneath the public persona. It had all started with that bus ride, that moment when two young men had mocked him, not knowing who he truly was. They had no idea that the man they ridiculed was the same man who had been working tirelessly to build a career, to break barriers, to find his own place in a world that often tried to force him into a box. And yet, in that moment, all they saw was a target, another black man on a bus, someone to be laughed at. Someone who didn't matter. He had taken the hits before. The racial stereotypes, the judgments, the constant battle to be seen as more than just a face or a body. But it was the insult on that bus that had been the tipping point. The thing that broke him open, that exposed the raw, unhealed wounds he had buried so deep within himself. As he walked through the streets, the city no longer seemed the same. The lights were brighter, the noise louder. People rushed by him, caught in their own worlds, unaware of the man who had just shed the mask he had worn for so long. He wasn't just Michael B. Jordan anymore. He wasn't the character they had built for him. He was himself. It wasn't until he reached his apartment building that he noticed the message on his phone. A text from his friend Brandon. "Hey man, I saw what happened. The bus incident. I know it hit you hard. But I need to tell you something. You won't believe it, but I think it's time you knew the truth. Call me when you can." Michael felt his stomach drop. The truth? He didn't waste time. He dialed Brandon's number immediately. The phone rang for a few moments before Brandon answered, his voice laced with urgency. "Mike, listen to me," Brandon began. "You're not going to believe this, but those two guys who mocked you on the bus. They didn't just pick on you at random. One of them, his name's Darnell, he's a huge fan of yours. He's followed your career for years. He knows who you are." Michael's mind raced. "What?" "No, I'm serious," Brandon continued. "I did some digging. Darnell, the guy who made the joke about you being nobody, he's actually the one who started this whole thing. The other guy, he had no clue who you were. But Darnell, he's been following you for a while. And when he saw you on that bus, he didn't see Michael B. Jordan the actor. He saw a man. A man who had been hiding his pain. And he thought he could teach you something." Michael couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Darnell? The guy who humiliated me? A fan?" "I know this is a lot to take in," Brandon said, his voice quieter now, "but that's not the crazy part. The crazy part is that Darnell reached out to me after the incident. He told me what happened, how he recognized you and how he was sorry. He said he was trying to show you something. He said he wanted to help you see yourself." Michael leaned against the door of his apartment, struggling to process what he had just heard. He had been mocked, humiliated, and rejected by someone who had, in fact, admired him all along. The confusion, the anger, it all swirled within him, threatening to overwhelm him. "But why would he do that?" Michael asked, his voice shaky. "Why would he make me the punchline of a joke?" "I don't know, man," Brandon replied. "But I think he's trying to tell you something important. He wants you to understand the truth, the thing you've been hiding from. He doesn't want you to keep living in the shadows of the person you've been pretending to be. He wants you to see the real you." A silence fell over the phone. Michael felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting, the layers of his reality slowly unraveling. For years, he had lived in the shadow of his fame, playing a role that others had written for him. He had put on a mask to protect himself from the hurt, from the vulnerability that came with being seen as both a symbol and an object. He had been living the life of Michael B. Jordan, the actor. But who was the real Michael B. Jordan? It wasn't the man who had been mocked on the bus. It wasn't the actor who played a role on a screen. It wasn't the man they all wanted him to be. The real Michael B. Jordan was the one who had endured pain, rejection, and hardship. He was the one who had faced mockery and humiliation, only to rise stronger each time. He was the one who had the courage to stand up, even when the world tried to tear him down. And now, it was time to live that truth. I see it now, Michael said softly, almost to himself. I see who I am. Brandon's voice broke through the silence. Exactly, man. You've always known it. It's time for you to take control of your own story. And don't let anyone, no matter who they are, write it for you. Michael nodded, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He didn't need to be Michael B. Jordan the actor. He didn't need to be anyone but himself. As he ended the call with Brandon, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The mockery, the pain, the rejection, it had all led him here. To this moment of truth. Michael stood tall, finally free from the mask, ready to face the world as who he truly was. And this time, no one would be able to take that from him. And as for Darnell, he had become the unwitting catalyst for Michael's awakening, the one who had pushed him to see the truth, no matter how painful or uncomfortable it had been. The twist was never about the mockery, it was about the realization that, sometimes, the people who hurt us the most are also the ones who show us the way forward.